She thought it would be a lesson. Instead, it became a legend. The parking lot was the kind of bland rectangle of asphalt that people forget until something dramatic happens, until someone slips on a latte, until headlights flare and tempers flare higher. It was mid-morning, sunlight like a promise, and Emily Bennett had rehearsed her indignation all the way from the subway. She had rehearsed the satisfaction of cold water on living flesh, the cinematic justice of salt stinging a liar's face. She had not rehearsed hitting the wrong man. She moved like adrenaline, fast, fumbling a bottle she had bought from the corner store because, in the private calculus of petty revenge, salt water was poetic and cheap. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. The woman she aimed for, an ex she'd spotted with a new girlfriend, unmistakable from the angle where hearts had been broken, darted behind a pickup, escaping. Emily's arm came down in a single, overconfident arc. The bottle's mouth opened. A collapsed sun of glass and plastic found a man in a gray suit. He turned at the sound of the splash. Water ran down the front of his black shirt, soaked the crispness of the tailoring. It streamed along the seam and fell over a piece of metal on his wrist. Emily saw silver swallow the light. She saw the watch, impossibly expensive and streaked with salt. Her chest hitched, immediately, with the intuitive shame of somebody who knew this was very wrong. He did not yell. He did not stagger. He stood there, water sliding off like a small defeat, and looked at her, not with anger, but with a baffled, assessing calm that felt worse than any shout. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the line of his mouth, the steady person he was not expecting to be splashed with cheap revenge. Then instinct took over. Emily turned and ran, her shoes thumped, breath ragged, hair whipping. She could already feel the neighborhood's quiet eyes like small accusations. She kept going until her lungs were a slow protest and the parking lot had receded into a narrative she couldn't yet own. She was not fast enough to outrun a phone. Someone in the lot had a camera perched on the car, an innocuous dash cam that would soon be recruited into the small, fierce machine of the internet. The footage was grainy. It caught a blur of jeans and the flash of a gray shoulder. The man's face was angled away. It should have been a closed case until curiosity did the rest. But this man was not any man. Elliot Hale noticed the water like an insult. He noticed the watch like a wound. Watches, in his world, announce things. Taste, caution, money managed well. The salt was an affront both to the object and to the order that object represented. He stood in the open-air lot, as if he were an island, and the salt water had been a suggestion of mutiny. Around him colleagues muttered, and his assistant, Jude, had already produced a small, efficient plan. "Security footage," Jude said, voice clipped. "Check the cameras on Hebron, ping lot attendants. I'll have PR pull anything off social." Elliot blinked, the corporate reflex unspooling in him. Identify, contain, respond. The jawline that made him interesting also made him decisive. A watch is replaceable, he told himself. Reputation is not, especially on a day when the company's name had been couching itself in delicate negotiations and a new CEO needed sunlight, not salt. But something else tightened in his chest as Jude left to execute. He had seen the woman move. He had registered the slope of her shoulders as if it contained a script he wanted to read. That, more than the ruined watch, stayed with him. The sense that she fled, not because she had nothing to hide but because she had everything to lose. It irritated him. It intrigued him. It established, with the vague, cruel geometry of his life, a problem to solve. By noon, the parking lot clip had slotted itself into a dozen feeds. Comments curled like quick vines. Who is he? New CEO? Did you see that watch? Luminex Studios trended for reasons that had nothing to do with films or talent. The image blurred. Speculation clarified. Someone tossed around a rumor about the value of that watch. People were always fond of assigning numbers to drama. Elliot watched it all happen with the composure of a man who owned consequences and the sudden private alarm of someone who understood how small things could snow into avalanches. He signed expenditures like a man vending weather, PR retainers, private investigators, overtime for the security team. Jude argued when he pushed deeper, articulating the ethical edges like barbed wire. "We're not going to put a full surveillance detail on citizens, sir," Jude said. "We'll be careful. Camera pulls, inquiries, legal will want to know." Elliot's answer was shorthand. "Find her." He did not specify scale. The people who worked under him had long since learned the difference between a direction and an order. Within 24 hours, a stack of items rolled across desks, footage requests, a paid-for poster circulator at the old women's social clubs, because every rich man has an old woman with a Rolodex, and a discreet matchmaking ad placed in the glossy margins of a lifestyle newsletter. It was ridiculous. It was effective. Money lubricated inertia. Meanwhile, Emily kept her head down. Work at Luminex was supposed to be the apprenticeship that would lead to steady credits and maybe a name on a show one day. She was a junior scriptwriter, which was to say she lived inside of other people's confessions and sold her own as sketches. That morning she told herself she'd be small, invisible, she would not show up on feeds or in lawsuits. But the world often has other plans for the unwary. At her desk, Tyler from development waved a phone. "Did you see this?" he asked. In his voice was the mix of shame and glee that office gossip owns. The clip stuttered across Emily's screen, the glimpse of the gray jacket, the watch, the blur of sprinting legs. Her stomach clenched. She realized with sudden crystalline dread how small her head must have looked on the footage. Her hands warmed as if the camera had caught more of her than she could bear. She kept her seat and pretended to type. She told herself that anonymity would protect her, until Jude came in under the radar, a human fact-checker. Luminex had security logs. Fingerprints weren't theirs to request, Jude said, but parking tickets and receipts were. People left traces. He moved through the office like a polite storm, asking the right people the right questions at the right volume to keep the rumor contained and the facts apportioned. Emily's first instinct was to flee. The second was to count. Rent, credit cards, her mother's nurse bills. Each item tallied into a quiet arithmetic that told her exactly what she could lose if anything at work unraveled. She had a roommate who would kick down on consequences if she had to. She had a manager who liked neat, problem-free employees. A viral clip might be a career's endnote for someone in her position, or a cause for a very uncomfortable conversation with the company's HR. She considered confession, imagined apologizing in the manager's office, then imagined the optics, junior staff defacing a CEO. She swallowed and told herself to breathe. She told herself to be careful. It was Grandma who broke the stalemate. Elliot's grandmother, Genevieve Hale, a compact woman with a tea-kettle laugh, and less patience for corporate coyness than she had for improper seating at Thanksgiving, liked to meddle the way tidal waves meddle, with the power to change shorelines. She was a collector of matches, not in the romantic sense, but in the practical social currency of finding good linking points. She had been asking Elliot about his calendar in the way that grandmothers ask about heartbeats. "Bring her home for tea," she would say, as if the tea itself could rewire fate. Grandma got it in her head that the right person for Elliot might in fact be the one who had splashed him. She liked stories where the young fell spectacularly into old-fashioned domesticity. She could smell romance and scandal like spices at a market, loud, inviting. So she did what she always had done. She pushed. A private matchmaking soiree, she insisted, would be the perfect solution to distract a household from the mundanities of corporate drama. The flyer she handed a friend at the club, an understated insert promising discreet introductions, traveled with the speed of things designed to be secret, but not really. That flyer was the same one Emily grabbed on a bored weekday, tired of being the person who only wrote scenes that ended in other people's happiness. It promised coffee, introductions, and a chance to meet interesting people in low-pressure situations. The price was something she could afford. Curiosity was something she couldn't not afford. The room at the event smelled faintly of almond candles and something overcompensating for its own quietness. Women and men sat at round tables under pendant lights, exchanging business cards and exaggerated smiles. Emily, who had come to practice lines for a pitch she would have to deliver in a week, sat in the corner with a notebook and the careful distance of someone whose life had been punctured recently. Elliot, who ordinarily preferred solitude and the kind of dull company that respected his schedule, was the kind of man who often found himself in the places other men avoided. He had gone to the event because his grandmother had insisted. He had gone because Genevieve had the ability to make his calendar look like a social obligation. He wore a shirt that had cost way more than the furniture in the room. He moved through the crowd like a misfiled adverb, correcting the rhythm of conversation with a small, decisive presence. He noticed details the way a screenwriter notices beats, the curl of someone's laugh, the tiny habitual gestures that reveal a person when words do not. When he saw her, it was a mild surgical coldness first, an attempt to align the blurred memory with the live scene. Then there was recognition that did not need to be translated into words. She had her head tilted, notebook closed, hands clasped. She wore a hat to conceal sleep perhaps, and an expression that said she did not belong to this world of lacquered introductions. He approached with the same precision that had people thinking twice about underestimating him. "You're Emily, right?" he said, because he knew the world liked to be named, and because he wanted it to be easier. She looked up, startled, because she thought she had been careful. Perhaps she had been careful enough that only the right people would notice. "Do I know you?" she said, raising her eyebrows like a shield. "You poured salt water on me in the parking lot," he said, which was less an accusation than an astonishing fact. Everyone within 2 tables turned their heads like a flock responding to a bell. Her face went 2 colors, hot, then pale. She opened her mouth. People do not rehearse humiliation for public consumption. They learn it raw. She tried to explain, but her words had been rehearsed on a different stage and they fell apart. She lied with the most complex kind of honesty, leaving things out because she could not bear telling them all. Elliot listened as if he had time to understand the architecture of her lie. When she reached for a plausible story about a spilled drink and a clumsy exit, he smiled the way someone smiles at a particularly awkward rehearsal. He could see the shape of her panic, the way it framed her decisions. He could see she was not a criminal, she was a woman who misfired. Then he drew a line. "You could be in trouble," he said, and the words were a lever. "You could lose your job. There are optics and there are costs. One of them is the watch. One of them is the lawsuit somebody with a good lawyer likes to make into a spectacle." The room hummed with the possibility. Emily's eyes went liquid. She asked the question everyone tells themselves to be brave enough to ask in private and cowardly enough to never ask in truth. "What do you want me to do?" He held out a folder like a magician revealing an uncomfortable trick. It contained not the abstract of a grievance, but the geometry of resolution. Forgive the watch, erase the embarrassment, sign a release, agree to a public relationship, temporary, staged, and contractually bound, until the company could move the narrative to a place where it no longer relied on pity or scandal. The contract read like a play, defined duration, public obligations, breach clauses that were stern and expensive. It was an arrangement that made lawyers smell of opportunity and romantics look away. Elliot's offer carried the weight of something more than legalese. It carried an edge of corporate geometry. "You help me clean this up," he said quietly, "and I'll make sure any compensation that comes your way covers what you're worried about." He was not promising miracles. He was promising the removal of an immediate threat, humiliation, exposure, and, most importantly, financial instability. Emily felt the floor tilt. The math of her life unfolded in a way that didn't need numbers. She pictured her mother, who had taught her to keep promises. She pictured bills stacking like quiet accusations. She pictured the scene in the parking lot like a photograph she could not darkroom. The choice in front of her was ugly in its candor and elegant in its coldness. Refuse and risk everything. Accept and take on a part that would be seen, parsed, and judged. This, in the middle of a room smelling of almond and collective hope, is where she made the decision that would define several months of both their lives. She agreed to the idea of a staged relationship. She said yes because survival has the honesty of a door that closes behind you. When you're inside, you cannot see the whole house. Jude watched the exchange from a distance, the human margin for caution. He was the practical spine to Elliot's impulses. He approached afterward with a stack of logistics and the precise language of consequences. "You know how this looks," Jude said. "It cannot look coercive. It must look consensual and voluntary." Elliot's voice was softer now, less the hammer of a man used to ordering the world into place. "It is voluntary," he said. "She has a choice." "But the optics," Jude began. "That's why we write language that protects both of us," Elliot answered. "And we make sure she has the resources to say yes of her own accord." The lawyers did their liturgy in a conference room that smelled of lemon oil and frightened ink. Contracts are grammar for bargaining, full stops that allow people to walk away without stumbling. Emily sat at the long table, palms flat, as a neat woman in glasses explained terms in a voice that did not intend to charm. There were clauses about public appearances, red carpet photos, staged dinners, scripted interviews. There were fees, escrow, and the right to terminate for cause. There was an unflattering penalty meant to make the arrangement real, an amount set so high that neither of them would ideally have to pay it. Numbers were not spoken aloud in detail. They exist in narrative as symbols of cost. Elliot did not need to say millions. The insurance policies, the PR retainers, the hotels already reserved spoke for it. Emily signed the line with a name that was not hers, Chloe Hart. She had picked the alias 3 days ago because it sounded like the kind of name that could both belong on a byline and disappear in conversation. She felt absurd as the pen moved, foolish and adult. The person signing the paper might as well have been somebody else, someone clever enough to survive and fragile enough to need help doing it. When she left the lawyer's office, it felt like stepping into a film set where everything was slightly too luminous. People noticed, people always did. Jude stayed back, efficient and watchful, and Elliot watched her leave not with triumph but with an observation that some private part of him took as a small victory. She had chosen to create a protection for herself. That night, Elliot authorized a raft of expenditures that demonstrated seriousness to the point of theatricality. He booked a suite at the Lexington for the first rehearsed dinner. He signed a check for a PR retainer to manage what he called, dryly, narrative flow. He paid for a discreet market research sweep to understand how the clip might evolve on feeds. He arranged for branded bouquets to be delivered to his grandmother because Genevieve liked proof, and proof costs money. There were murmurs at Luminex. Some people called it showmanship. Some called it a responsible containment strategy. Whoever called it anything agreed that a CEO who spent this level of effort to orchestrate a private facade was either desperately invested or indulgently cruel. The board would have opinions. The board would ask for briefing notes. Elliot, when he wrote them, kept the human part of the memo short. Contain, compensate, close the story. Meanwhile, Emily, caravan of receipts in her bag, practiced how to smile without lying. She tried on roles like coats, which is to say she learned which fit and which made her shoulders ache. She attended rehearsals with a small nervous group, a date coach who used phrases like sustain plausible intimacy, a stylist who preferred the term executive-friendly, and a publicist who suggested safe lines for answering intrusive questions. They taught her how to hold Elliot's hand in public without letting it feel like a lease. In private, however, the rehearsals kept slipping into real moments, little technical errors at first, then something more. Once, when she arrived late to a staged breakfast, Elliot had already been there, staring at a piece of paper with the precision of a man aligning a script. He smiled, a private, unpracticed smile she had never seen in the boardroom. It tugged at her in a way she could not admit to herself. She catalogued it as a new, inconvenient truth. Sawyer Clark complicated the ledger. He had been a classmate who got bolder with time. He confessed over stale coffee in the kind of speech that had been practiced without risk. "I like you," he told Emily bluntly, as if his confession could be a currency she had been waiting to accept. He seemed to think that the thing between them could be resumed like a business meeting after a short intermission. Emily felt the ache of an old comfortable map and the terror of a new uncharted one. She said nothing substantial because she had learned that silence can be its own speech. Then there was Stella Monroe, the soft, precise transatlantic complication who arrived with an engagement ring nested in the sort of publicity that looked prepared for magazines. Stella was a name Elliot had used in conversations that were half myth and half rumor, the kind of figure that lights up tabloids with the suggestive glow of before. Her arrival was like a scent that disoriented a room, expensive perfume, a neat accent, and a presence that read like a statement. People began to ask questions again, only this time questions had teeth. Grandma loved the spectacle and cranked the machine higher. She had set the first pieces in motion. Now she was the one turning the crank into full roar, insisting on an afternoon of tea with both Emily and Stella present because we need to see who's clasping whose hands for the cameras. Genevieve's Heim, her absolute certainty, was a force that turned events toward collisions like a comet bent toward gravity. Rumors accumulated like unpaid bills. There were whispers that the staged relationship might be something else. There were suggestions that the woman had something to hide. An influencer stitched together stills into an insinuation. A gossip blog ran a take that was unkind and assumed motive. Luminex's PR team moved like a lifeguard crew, throwing a rope and scanning the crowd for ripples. Then, as always in the era of spectacle, a clip found the wrong tide. Someone posted a screenshot of Emily on a call that showed her face more clearly than the original. The assumptions leapt like children across a fence. A narrative that had been contained in quiet contracts and tasteful dinners began to squeal itself into something louder. If the contract had been the attempt to make a private solution public and tidy, the new post made public what it had hoped to keep discreet. A narrative of power, a whisper of coercion, a chorus that liked hard stories because they cut well. Elliot watched this unfolding with a new kind of heat. It was one thing to orchestrate a closure. It was another to have the closure combust into suspicion about the thing itself. He called an emergency PR meeting in a room whose walls had seen 100 reputational fights. He had a succinct, honest sentence prepared. "We will not allow speculation to define what is real." That line was both defense and a dare. But truth has a way of demanding witnesses. Emily, who had been trained to navigate the messy architecture of other people's truths for a living, did what she always had been terrible and brave at doing. She spoke. She walked into the meeting where executives debated the optics like surgeons chart a tough case and told them the simplest thing. She had chosen the arrangement because it was the only way to protect her job and her family. She admitted her mistake at the parking lot, the misunderstanding of targets, the speed of her flight. She told them, without the dramatic flourishes people often asked for, that she had been terrified and she had acted. Her voice was small in the beginning and then taller. "I wanted to fix a wrong in the worst way possible," she said. "I panicked. I ran. The rest of this," she tapped the file, "is me trying to make sure the panic didn't cost me everything. That's all. I'm not a victim of anything but my own bad choices." It was not the kind of confession that makes headlines because it lacked scandal porn, but it carried a sturdiness no one expected from a junior writer whose life was only just being threaded into public scrutiny. It made the room glance at one another in a new way. It complicated the tidy narratives they preferred. Elliot watched her with that slow, accumulating interest that feels like a sediment forming in the bottom of the heart. He heard her choices not as capitulation but as strategy, the way someone with limited power rearranged themselves against the current. He could see the line of fear that ran under her politeness and the kind of stubbornness he had like a family trait. The story could have ended there, in the neat bureaucracy of a corporate PR cleanup and a lawyered silence. It did not, because in the small spaces between contracts and headlines, people revealed chambers of themselves they did not mean to show. Elliot, who had begun this as a problem to be solved, found himself remaking the problem into something else. He spent to make it quiet, yes, but also to find her, because in his life, answers had become oddly religious. Money could buy a lot of things, it could not buy curiosity's finish. He authorized searches, yes, but he also authorized gentler spending, a set of rehearsals for public tenderness that were paid for by the company, but designed with an intimacy that looked like charity. He paid for dinners that made paparazzi indolent. He bought advertorial space that steered the narrative toward mutual agreement. Each purchase was a tile in a mosaic designed to protect an image. Each tile was expensive in ways that could be read as theatrical or sincere. The headlines might have said, "CEO spends millions," and they would not have entirely been wrong. There were retainers and suites and flower deliveries and PR buys. There were also small things like a jacket returned to her because of a minor tear he had noticed and had the seamstress fix. These were the quieter sums that added up to a kind of currency he could not name. Emily's life, meanwhile, changed by degrees. The public became a stage she had to cross with enough grace to meet the obligations the contract required. She learned to laugh when cameras expected the sound. She learned to let Elliot be near without cataloguing it as an intrusion. Small gestures, for example, him noticing she always took her coffee with one sugar, settled into rhythms they did not intend. She began to keep a folder labeled Chloe Hart, like a talisman of the way she had been forced to become someone else. And yet, the thing that troubled both of them, beneath the strategizing and the rehearsals, was simple. They had started as a transaction. Should a transaction ever grow into something true? It was an ethical question, and an emotional one, and it moved like slow weather through their days. On one rainy afternoon, after a press event where they had smiled on cue and the tabloids had dutifully described their caretaken chemistry, Elliot walked Emily back to her small apartment. He held an umbrella like a practical man handles a protractor. Efficient, necessary. The rain clung to the fabric like a hush. She felt ridiculous standing so close to a man whose watch had first been damaged by her. She wanted to step away. Instead, something curious happened. He reached into his pocket and produced a small key. "For the suite at the Lexington," he said. "It's paid for the month. You can use it if you need a place to get away from the—" He gestured vaguely to everything. From the noise, she accepted the key like a person accepting a favor with strings attached. She felt the tug of power in that action. He had bought privacy for her, and it collided with the uglier truth that she owed him something. She also felt gratitude. Choosing gratitude did not remove the calculus. It folded into it. On the street, a camera took a single frame of them. Umbrella, key, the way he angled his body as if shielding. The frame became a small proof against the gossipy narratives. People wrote about him reclaiming narrative control. People also wrote that he was merciful. People always sought a comfortable story. At home, Emily unpacked the gift of a suite like one removes a bandage, slowly, with a sense that it was healing that stung. Alone that night, she heard herself practice answers to questions she might never be asked, and smiled when the answers felt like rehearsed muscles beginning to flex as if they might one day be real. By the time she slept, the parking lot splash was already an echo. The world had moved on to other scandals, as the internet often does. But the living consequences of the splash hung like a banner between two people. A contract signed with an alias, the watch repaired, a PR retainer running, a grandmother pleased, a man who had spent money to find what he had not yet named. No one could say then what the money had bought besides time and a rumor's suppression. No one could know that spending could sometimes be a way of searching, an attempt to make a private ledger balance in the public eye. For now, the ledger was messy and human, replete with fragile entries. Emily's fear, Elliot's curiosity, the world's appetite for tidy stories. If you want to see how this unlikely deal turns into something real, stick around. There's more than a contract here. There are choices that keep shifting the scale between a bargain and a beginning. They rehearsed for appearances like actors in a film without a script. Elliot learned how to say things like, "We met at a charity function," when the public wanted simplicity. Emily learned how to say, "We're taking things slowly," which meant a dozen things at once. They sat in staged restaurants where the menu felt like part of the set, and where the maître d' bowed for reasons that had less to do with hospitality and more to do with optics. They sat on balcony ledges and pretended to watch sunsets while researchers monitored social sentiment. At work, whispers became a low, persistent hum. Every email that slipped into Emily's inbox was a test of nerve. Every glance from a coworker was a variable. Sawyer tried to be helpful once, dropping off a book of plays at her desk as if to remind her of the person she once was. "For the scenes," he said, "for when you want a line that's yours." "You should be in them," she said, because it was easier to speak to the idea than to the man. He smiled, and his smile was the sort that keeps doors open. But doors, she had learned, have hinges greased by choices. Elliot, on his side, found that spending money to locate her had become an art he practiced privately. He was not proud, always, of the lengths he authorized. He had staff who argued for limits, and those who argued for total containment. He listened to both, because he liked the feel of being wise, and because he liked the particular reward of being in control. He paid for investigations, and they returned small, fragile details. A receipt at a cafe 2 neighborhoods over, a photo of a woman with a hat, a pattern that looked suspiciously like a life. There were nights he lay awake and tried to think of himself as anything but a man who paid to solve questions. He imagined, absurdly, that the answer might be to stop spending at all and simply live, allowing whatever happened to move on its own. But the world he managed did not permit that kind of surrender easily. Money promised motion. It moved mountains of curiosity into slightly softer, more manageable valleys. Grandma watched all of it like a woman observing her own garden. She plucked at stems and nudged stems into place. She saw in their contract the possibility of a union and the value of a narrative that closed without mess. She also had a sharp eye and would, at times, push them into rooms to make them see each other not as actors but as people. Emily's last weekend before the public appearance they had to stage found her in the Lexington, small room lit in a way that made walls feel like a theater. She sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded a program that detailed a small, carefully curated life for two. Dinners, interviews, the occasional public hike. It read like a script, and sometimes that frightened her. But there was also a line in it that was not in the contract. It was not legal or binding. It simply said, "Be honest." She did not know yet how to make honesty useful. She did not know if the honesty would be enough to make the bargain cease to be a bargain. She did not know if the man whose watch had first caught the light would ever be able to lower his defenses for the sake of something delicate and human. Outside, rain began its soft, steady tapping. It was the same element that had started the whole thing. Water, banal and spectacular. It had torn the satin of a watch and then cushioned lives with a kind of small weather. Emily watched a bead of water slide down the window and realized that, for the first time since the parking lot, she could name the cost of her mistake in something other than fear. The cost was still there, so was the choice to pay it, and for the moment, that would have to be enough. The week after the contract felt like living inside a rehearsal that had nowhere to go but deeper. Days folded into scenes, scripted dinners, polite smiles, an afternoon of charity paddle boats where a PR photographer made sure every oarstroke looked like affection, and yet something in the choreography began to loosen. Small private slips revealed that the stage could hold more than a performance. They practiced greetings and exits, but Elliot's most dangerous rehearsals were the ones he did alone. Phone calls to accounts payable, signed authorizations for discreet searches, messages to external advisors asking for background checks that stopped short of anything invasive. He authorized retainer fees, paid to have narratives softened in influencer circles, covered travel expenses for witnesses who might need to be asked questions away from public feeds. The sum of those purchases was shorthand in the office gossip. He was spending millions. The phrase floated like a feather in the newsroom air and weighed differently on different people. Shock for some, scorn for others, and quiet, grudging admiration in those who measured power by its ability to move obstacles out of the way. Jude left a post-it on Elliot's desk once. "We can tighten scope. Ethical boundaries are sharp lines." Elliot folded it into his pocket and nodded like a man who owned the hand that wrote it. He wanted to be careful. He also wanted to be thorough. There is a difference between search and siege, he told himself. He worked to honor it. He made sure legal reviewed every authorization, that the PR buys were classified as narrative management, that payments intended to compensate Emily and make space for a voluntary choice were handled through escrow and independent counsel. He authorized expensive things because speed often needs money to move. Legal counsel in a weekend, a flight redirected to get a witness statement, a boutique detective commissioned to do nothing more than confirm a profile. At the same time, Genevieve's interventions multiplied. If she could not solve a problem with tea and a matchmaking flyer, she would manufacture an invitation. "See you Sunday, bring her, no excuses." Elliot answered with the patience of a man who had learned that his grandmother's insistence was part parental commandment and part social weather that could not be ignored. Emily, who had once been capable of outrunning more literal storms, found herself pacing in front of the Hales' low, neat fireplace, forced to practice small talk until the words felt rehearsed and not defensive. The grandmother's house smelled of orange oil and old books. Genevieve had a way of making judgment sound like affection. She would place two hands on Emily's shoulders and say, "You have good hands. You can hold a life if you choose to." It was not pressure exactly, it was the way the elderly make pressure look like an offering. The scene stung Emily with the honesty grandparents have of being able to connect the seen with the unseen. She learned fast that being accepted by Genevieve was less about truth than about the theatricality of belonging. Genevieve's blessing was a kind of social currency no PR firm could buy. Stella arrived like a headline. She stepped off a flight with a carriage and accent that read as editorial. She moved through the city with the certainty of someone raised to be noticed. Her engagement rumor, an item that should have been a quiet note in a society column, landed on the desk of every gossip editor with the hopeful velocity of a comet. Stella was not merely another figure in Elliot's past, she was the perfect counterpoint to Emily's every woman quiet. Where Emily was hand-stitched floors and unscripted laugh lines, Stella was press-release polished and mindfully photogenic. They put Emily and Stella in the same room because Genevieve insisted on it, not because PR suggested drama. The Hale living room, which ordinarily hosted charity committees and small kind criticisms, became a stage with a low center. Stella sat with a practiced smile, a cup of tea between both hands like a small argument for propriety. She spoke of travel, of charity boards, of a calm life. Emily listened and realized she had been learning to measure her worth by how well she performed consent. Stella, with a quick compassion and a slower smile, extended a friendly hand and said, "It must be strange to rehearse intimacy." Her tone could have been a critique or an offer of membership. It was both. Sawyer, meanwhile, hovered like a memory with too many expectations. He sent messages that landed in the edges of Emily's day, books left at her desk, a lunch that arrived like a question. His confession 2 weeks earlier had been honest. He had not performed his affection to win her back so much as to stake his claim on a simpler future. He wanted a map they both understood. Coffee, theater, a life undramatic enough to be safe. Emily liked Sawyer's steadiness in the quiet way you like soup when you're tired. But the contract had rearranged the geometry of choice. It had made simple acts complicated by the currency that had been exchanged in private. The payments, the hotel keys, the retainer fees, these were like subtle weights that hung on her decisions. The PR storm, which had been smoothed into careful waves by bought stories and editorial handshakes, boiled over in a way neither the PR team nor Elliot had fully accounted for. A journalist with a flair for public accountability published a piece that asked the question everyone found delicious. When a powerful CEO offers protection in exchange for public affection, is it protection or a soft bargain? The question spread not because it was new, but because the era required a voice for suspicion. People loved to watch power be accounted for. The board called an emergency meeting. They did not call it for the voyeuristic thrill of gossip. They called it for damage control and fiduciary concern. Elliot sat under cold light and explained with the crisp language of someone who had always preferred to translate emotion into memos. This was containment, not coercion. He explained escrow arrangements, independent counsel for Emily, and the PR buys that had been intended to steer but not to silence. He was thorough because he knew the language they respected. Some of the board's faces softened, others remained the architecture of corporate prudence. Jude watched every exchange like a man who had to enforce the law of consequences. He voiced concerns gently and bluntly. "We must be beyond reproach. The optics are not just PR. They matter for our staff. They matter for people who feel they must take a stand because they have been hurt." He requested changes to the script. He requested time for Emily to have her counsel present whenever legal representatives met. He requested that all personal gifts be documented. Jude's list was long and felt like a small, disciplined rebellion in a room that favored expedience. Elliot complied because it was the right thing to do, and because he had, in truth, started caring about Emily in ways that made compliance less like sacrifice and more like investment. He agreed that money could not replace consent. He agreed that her voice needed amplification as much as any PR push. He arranged for independent counsel to be paid directly from his private accounts, not company coffers, so that Emily could seek advice that did not require loyalty to corporate interests. He transferred funds into an escrow account that allowed Emily to consult with any professional she chose, therapist, lawyer, financial advisor, and told her, plainly, that she could walk away without penalty if she decided the arrangement harmed her. That decision changed the tenor of their relationship. The knowledge that she had a legal and financial buffer, that she could, theoretically, leave without the crushing weight of the penalty, began to loosen the psychological leash the contract held on her. It did not erase the awkwardness of shared public events, nor did it remove the way her colleagues still watched, but it gave her breathing room. Then the accusation that had been loitering in the corners arrived like a storm front. An anonymous claim on a social platform alleged harassment. It was thinly sourced and clearly speculative, but the internet did not ask for better evidence when appetite for outrage was high. Someone stitched a timeline from the dating of posts, from the time the contract was signed, from Emily's public appearances, overlaid with quotes taken out of context. Images of the parking lot splashed across the story like a headline doing its job. Emily read the story in a kitchen that belonged to a roommate who insisted on optimism. She unfolded the laptop as if it were a letter with a bad signature. Her chest tightened. The world loves to impose narratives. It prefers them tidy. The accusation wanted a villain and a victim. She was terrified that the role assigned to her would be victim, or worse, suspect accessory. She could have retreated. She could have let legal and PR handle it. But she was a writer. She had been trained to narrate other people's truths and to tell the ones she kept in notes. She walked into the PR room where executives had been playing damage control for days with the same fierce quiet she'd brought to everything else. She had not prepared a statement in lawyer-approved language. She did not want one. She wanted to speak plainly. "People are making a story about me because it's easier," she said, voice steadying as the room inhaled. "I did dumb, reckless things. I panicked. I made a mistake at the parking lot. Everything else, that contract, appearances, that was me choosing what I thought would be the least damaging path for the people who rely on me. For my mom, for my work. If you want a villain, you'll make one up. But I'm not being paid to be silent. I'm not being silenced." Her words did something the PR team had not anticipated. They reframed the conversation. Suddenly the story was about choice, not merely power. People with axes to grind still ground them, but others, callers from the writers' program she'd once helped, spoke of the courage of owning mistakes. Some opinion columns softened, noting that consenting adults sometimes made poor bargains and that the right response was scrutiny without spectacle. Elliot saw her speak across the room and felt something in him flip from proprietorship to care. He had started buying time to make the noise less damaging. He had not expected to find himself wanting to protect more than his image. He had not expected to find himself wanting to be known in the terms she chose to name herself. In the days that followed, Elliot's spending traced bits of tenderness and strategy. He paid for counseling sessions that Emily could schedule when she wanted. He booked a remote cabin for a weekend and told her she could use it pit-stop free of cameras, the payment labeled in his ledger as employee wellness. He paid for Stella's return flight home when the tabloids began to insist on a narrative with multiple players. The purchases were sometimes theatrical, the kind of expense reporters loved to tally, but they were also pragmatic: private counsel, escrow, hotel rooms where they could walk without microphones. Still, there was human friction. Chloe Hart, his public alias name for her, was suddenly a person with preferences who needed to be listened to. The team that had orchestrated their first public interviews was retooled to allow Emily more say. Scripted lines were tossed out when she wanted to say something in her own voice. When the PR team suggested a joint interview where both would recite a pre-approved sentiment about mutual respect, Emily refused to memorize someone else's tenderness. Before the charity gala that had been scheduled months in advance, tension grew. Stella made a social appearance meant to calibrate the record, stated as a courtesy call, but read by everyone as competition. Sawyer, dignified in his low-key face of earnestness, offered Emily a kind of normalcy that had a quiet, almost dangerous appeal. The gala was held in an old train terminal polished into grandeur. Lights arced over marble, and high-ceilinged rooms hummed like a living thing. Elliot had poured resources, both company-backed and private, into the night. Photographers were pre-briefed to focus on the charity, not the couple. Gentlemen's clubs were called to mind in the floral arrangements. It was a night intended to look like the world was not paying attention to them, while in truth it was the top item on several editors' lists. Midway through the program, a blogger attempted to throw a gauntlet, asking a question about consent in a way loaded with implication. The room held its breath, the kind that comes when restaurant plates pause mid-chew and conversations go quiet. Elliot's first instinct was to answer with corporate politeness. Then he saw Emily's jaw set in a way that told him she would speak if he did not. She rose. It was a small gesture. She had been rehearsed to smile and let him handle the optics. But she stood anyway. The microphone was warm and public. She did not read from a script. "I made a mistake," she said to the room who had come to be amused. "I took a terrible approach to something very human. But I agreed to this because I needed to protect the people I love. I am not a prop and I have agency. This conversation matters. Not because I want sympathy, but because power mistakes can happen anywhere. We should hold people accountable, yes. We should do it fairly. My choice to step into a public life in order to mitigate harm was mine." The room moved like the sea after that. Some applauded, some frowned, some wrote notes that would appear in the next morning's column. But the moment had stripped some of the easier narratives. It exposed a woman who could speak without the neat, sensational gestures gossip hoped for. It revealed a complexity that made it harder for the public to peddle a simple moral. Later that evening, after speeches and applause, after Genevieve had cornered the caterer with the easy affection of someone who sees the world as a set of gatherings to be supervised, Elliot found Emily in a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of the studio's past productions. The world outside hummed with its appetite for a story. Inside the hallway, there was the quiet of back rooms where people decompress. "You should not have taken that mic if you didn't want the heat," he said, more a statement than an admonition. "I could not let them decide the moral for me," she replied, breathing out. "I didn't want to be the answer to a question I never asked." He considered the set of words she had chosen and felt, again, that sediment forming in him. He had been a man who bought solutions. He had always assumed money could make consequence negotiable. But what he was learning, confusingly and wonderfully, was that money could only clear paths so far. It could not make someone love you. It could not make someone trust you. It could sometimes give a person the room to choose. He decided, in a way he did not plan to explain to the board, to stop treating his search for her like a transaction. He would keep the legal protections and the escrow. He would keep the PR moderating the noise. But he also began, in small gestures, to make purchases that had nothing to do with optics. An evening class at a small theater for Emily and him, because she loved stories. A donation to a program that funded scriptwriters because she had once performed for cheap coffee. A set of books by playwrights he thought she might like. They were extravagances only in the way his life was used to labeling things expensive. For Emily, they felt like curiosity rendered in currency. The climax came not on a rooftop nor in front of flashing paparazzi, but in a place meant for human vows. The studio's newly restored small theater, chosen for an anniversary event at which the studio's donors gathered to celebrate independent voices. The evening, curated to feel like a love affair with art, had the accidental quality of truth. An audience full of people who valued honesty and narrative, and lights that could not be made to flatter. The online world loved the juxtaposition because it feeds on contrast. A CEO who could be both powerful and awkward in equal measure was an irresistible image. But the theater that night was not outside. The seats were close, and the air smelled of paint and coffee. Elliot had arranged the seating himself, an intentional act, not a grand display. He placed Genevieve near the front because a grandmother's attendance makes people take things more seriously than pretty prose. Mid-program, Elliot asked to speak. It was not a long speech. He had learned that long speeches are often defenses dressed as philosophy. He walked to the microphone in a way that suggested he could do the corporate thing and the tender thing at once. "People ask why I spent so much to find someone who could have been anybody," he began, looking at Emily in the front row like a man reading from a page he had been writing in secret. "The answer is always going to sound like a line from a play, because curiosity and because I wanted to know who she was. But that's not the whole thing. I paid for searches and lawyers and PR because I wanted to give her the space to make a choice without being forced into it by fear. I paid because when things happen, public mistakes, people deserve an honest chance to fix them without losing everything." The crowd listened like a city that recognizes sincerity when it is not packaged. There was a rustle of acknowledgement from those who had seen power used badly before and appreciated a man trying to repair something with more than press releases. He turned then toward Emily and said something he had not prepared for his board and did not have to explain to the legal counsel who sat far off to the side. "Emily," he said, plain and oddly fragile, "you signed a contract because you were afraid. You chose to walk into my life because it seemed the safest way to protect the things you love. I asked you to perform a life with me on a stage where you were always at risk of being edited. That was wrong. I thought I could buy abandon, and I couldn't. I thought I could buy safety, and I forgot that people sometimes need freedom more than security. I would like, if you will allow me, to stop buying things as answers, and instead ask you for a chance to build something without transactions." He paused. The pause lasted like a breath held underwater. Then, with the clumsy human courage of someone trying to translate feeling into action, he added, "Will you marry me?" The room did not explode in applause in that instant. It trembled with a collective held breath. Genevieve let out a small sound that from the front row sounded like the reopening of an old relieved valve. Emily's hand found her chest like she was steadying herself in a moment that could tip into absurdity if she did not stay present. She had, after all, rehearsed smiles for cameras. She had not rehearsed the exact shape of what she felt. "Do you mean as a solution?" she asked, because she would not accept a life that replaced coercion with convenience. "No," he said, and the single word thawed something in the audience. "I mean as a choice. No lawyers, no penalties, no escrow in perverse ink. I mean, if you will have me, an actual choice. If at any point you want out, you walk. I will honor that. I do not want to buy you. I want to be the kind of man who can be chosen freely." It was the most expensive thing he could have offered, and the least purchasable. Vulnerability traded honestly. For an instant, every condensed cost he had authorized seemed trivial next to the gesture. The optics-hungry world outside the theater would make its own narratives. Inside, there were two people and a question that had to be answered in the only language that mattered. Emily looked at the faces in the rows as if collecting the evidence of herself from others' eyes. Sawyer's jaw tightened in the half-shadow. Stella's stare was a silent, precise thing that managed to be gracious and disappointed. But the world beyond their ring of faces did not need to decide. This was between them. She thought of her mother and the money she owed at the clinic. She thought of the echo of a watch ticking somewhere an ocean away. She thought of being pursued, not by investigators, but by the unusual warmth of a man who noticed sugar in her coffee. The contract had been a cage she chose to enter out of fear. Elliot's public proposal offered the possibility of a different kind of captivity, one built from choice, not obligation. It was terrifying. It was also startlingly that rare thing, an answer she had not rehearsed psychologically but had felt moving toward her. "Yes," she said with the slow clarity of someone selecting a path she might walk fearfully but willingly. But not as a shield, as a beginning. The theater exhaled like a thing that had been taught the truth. Phones rose, not to catch the moment for headlines, but because living people reach for proof of having seen something authentic. Genevieve wept like a small bird, and then swallowed it because she knew the cameras loved tears and the heart of her wanted a quieter display. The next days were messy in the way truth often is. Headlines did what headlines do. Some newspapers were charmed, others cynical. The board had mixed feelings, but Elliot's candidness calmed them in a way their spreadsheets never could. They did not treat his impulsive spending as the foolishness of a man in love, but as an expensive lesson about control. The PR team negotiated with the social media algorithms and a few influencers who admired a story with an apparent moral arc. At the studio, conversations changed tone. People who had been skeptical of a CEO using resources in personal ways watched as he repurposed those resources towards systemic efforts, funds for script scholarships, a program to help junior staff with financial literacy, a policy review of personal relationships at work. Whether those steps were performative or sincere was a question for another day, but they sent a message. The man who had authorized purchases to quiet a scandal now used his leverage to try to improve the system that had made such a bargain plausible. Emily's career did not explode into overnight stardom, nor did she become a caricature of a woman saved by a man. She returned to her desk with a new kind of corporation around her, one that had repurposed a crisis into a set of policies and a man who, in private, worked to be different. She kept her desk and her roommate and chaperoned herself through awkward staff dinners. She took the theater class Elliot had signed them up for reluctantly at first, then with a growing guilty joy. She learned to perform, yes, but also to feel a new authenticity inside the stage syllables. Sawyer handled his disappointment with a kind of foreign politeness and a promise to remain friends. He was not erased from the story. He remained a quiet, steady node in Emily's life, someone she could call when the world grew heavy. Stella returned to her life in Europe with dignity intact. In a later interview, she expressed hope that two people would find in one another what they needed. Genevieve, who never believed privacy was anything but theatrical, set about arranging a small private engagement party where she insisted on the right playlist and a guest list that read like a cross-section of the family's moral obligations. The final image, the one that would hang in their private album, not the tabloids, was small and unplanned. It happened 2 weeks after the proposal in a Lexington suite window that had been a theater for rehearsals and finally became a home for an afternoon. Rain had returned, the element that had started everything, and in some grimly poetic way, validated it by its persistence. They were in the small kitchen of the suite, a contraption of modern convenience and soft rugs. Emily had a kettle on. He was at the sink, hand over the basin, turning a watch strap with gentle fingers. The repaired watch, that quiet shard of their initial violence, lay on the counter, shined and steady. They were not rehearsing. No PR person was nearby. No photographer was waiting. The only witness was Genevieve's idea of photography, an old Polaroid camera she had smuggled, and a roommate who owed a favor. As rain made the windows fog, Elliot turned and offered her a cup of tea like an unpremeditated mercy. She said nothing and took the cup. He watched the steam curl and felt suddenly the absurd smallness of all the purchases he had made. Money could buy warmth and privacy and protection. It could not manufacture the quiet of two people choosing to sit with one another while the world raged outside. That somehow was the most expensive lesson. Genevieve, unable to resist the urge to document, squinted through the old lens and captured them as they were. Umbrella forgotten, hair damp at the edges, smiles that had not been primed, a watch between them like the relic of a world they had altered. The Polaroid slid out, and for a breath they watched the image form. Two people in a small kitchen, not posed, not polished, not strategized, simply present. It was, in its ordinary way, everything. When the tabloids later tried to simplify the narrative, to tally the figure of money spent and assign a moral weight to each dollar, the photograph resisted easy categorization. It told a different story. Of a man who had tried to buy certainty and instead learned how to ask for permission. Of a woman who had chosen to stay because she found something she felt might be real and because she knew she could leave if it wasn't. The studio's newsletter ran a short, factual piece about the couple's engagement, paired with a thoughtful note from Elliot about responsibility and consent in leadership. The piece did not attempt to explain the intricacies of private contracts or the ethics of corporate resources. It merely stated that mistakes happen and that accountability must follow. People debated the story on podcasts and in office break rooms. Some praised, some criticized. But among the noise, there was a quieter truth that mattered more to the two people involved. Months later, at a small family ceremony under strings of yellow lights and the inevitable clink of cutlery, Emily and Elliot stood together and read vows no lawyer had crafted. She promised honesty and the freedom to question. He promised to defend her autonomy and to never assume money could fix the aching parts of intimacy. The board sent a tasteful, if tepid, congratulatory message. Genevieve drank more champagne than was strictly necessary and declared, loudly and with delighted finality, that she had always known what would happen if we poured a little water on the situation. The world would, as it always does, continue to create new scandals and new victims of its appetite for tidy stories. But in that personal orbit, the contract was folded into a drawer where it belonged. A paper that had served its purpose and then been replaced by something more fragile and less litigable, trust. Their first unscripted kiss did not arrive on a stage. It arrived in a moment between speeches at the reception, while Emily was laughing at something Sawyer said, and Elliot reached across the table to brush a drop of condensation from her chin. The gesture was small. The press was not there to catch it. Later, when photographers sought the shot for the next installment of their story, the only photograph that truly mattered was the Polaroid Genevieve had taken in the Lexington suite, the one that captured them without an audience, without a PR brief, simply being present in the rain. He had spent millions, some wrote, to find a woman he barely knew. He had spent money to control optics, to repair damaged reputation, to buy time and counsel and quiet rooms where choices could be made. But what those tallies did not convey was the truth that emerged from the purchase's wake, that money had given them space to choose, and it was choice, earnest, free, reversible, that became the currency that mattered. There was no tidy morale to hand to the public. There was only an ordinary truth strung through extraordinary events. People make mistakes. Powerful people must be accountable for how they use power. And sometimes, in the mess of repair, two people find a way to build something that looks, finally, like hope. If you liked this unlikely rescue, subscribe for more stories where one reckless moment changes two lives.